It's Orange and Blue today, presented by Sean Ponda, Cecil, Lammey, and Andrew Mason with our special What If category. We have a lot of different What If shows to do. I think we might be starting with my favorite one today, Mace.
This is why I chose this one to open this with as we're getting through the next few weeks as training camp on the horizon. But let's face it, this is kind of the downtime right now.
Yeah.
So we're going to bring up some of that downtime with a what if that I would say continues to reverberate through the Broncos today.
A what if that goes back and, well, speaking of down, it's going to make a lot of Broncos fans down because Kyle Shanahan could have been hired by this team instead of Vance Joseph. And you could have gone from a Super Bowl 50 era with Gary Kubiak. Instead of going to the Vance Joseph era for a couple of years, you could have gone to the Kyle Shanahan era. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this conversation, but Kyle Shanahan had the same record as Vance Joseph over their first 2 years. They don't have the same record now. Obviously, VJ hasn't been a head coach again, but let's just start there. And how would things be different had the Broncos hired Kyle Shanahan back in 2017 instead of Vance Joseph?
Well, let's start with the quarterback position because I believe that the Broncos, 1 year into Kyle Shanahan's stewardship, would have signed Kirk Cousins as a free agent. Kyle Shanahan, of course, had coached Kirk Cousins in Washington, where he was before he went on to Cleveland and then became Atlanta's offensive coordinator, which his success in Atlanta, an all-time offense in 2016, that put him on everybody's radar for coaching interviews, including the Broncos, where he interviewed early in 2017. But he and Mike Shanahan were a part of drafting and developing Kirk Cousins in Washington in the 2012 and 2013 seasons. Cousins was set to be a free agent heading into 2018. I think in 2017, he would have probably just kind of ridden what they had. Maybe had a mid-round pick. Maybe they would have taken C.J. Beathard like the 49ers did in 2017. But I think by 2018, Kirk Cousins would have been a Denver Bronco playing with a coach in an offense in which he had been proven to excel.
Yes. And that would have been huge because then you wouldn't have had the quarterback carousel and the graphic on every Broncos game that you got until Russell Wilson.
This is the jumping off point. 2017, I think it would have maybe looked in terms of record very similar to the way it actually looked under Vance Joseph, 5-11 season. Mm-hmm. I don't think the Broncos would have been good that year because they would have been dealing with the less than stellar quarterback material they had on hand. And I don't believe that they would have been able to get Kirk Cousins from Washington then because they gave Cousins a second franchise tag for the 2017 season. They tagged him for 2016. Then they tagged him again in 2017. It was Cousins' sixth year in the league. They had to tag him in years 5 and 6 because, of course, he didn't get the fifth-year option because he came into the league as a fourth-round pick. So that first year, I think that 2017 season might have been a difficult year to get through. But on the other side of it, I think it would have looked a lot different. Now, the question is, would the drafting have been better with Kyle Shanahan working with John Elway rather than Vance Joseph and on to Vic Fangio?
Would John Elway have stayed around? Or would he, and John Elway could have hung it up after Super Bowl 50, but would he have stayed around even longer or put more emphasis on that part or got another person, another Brian Sanders?
Or maybe, Mike Shanahan would have been floating around the building in unofficial capacity.
Well,
he kind of floats around the 49ers to this day in an unofficial capacity. Basically, Mike Shanahan in San Francisco is an unpaid advisor / coach,
right?
But he is very plugged into what's going on and is very much a part of things that happen in San Francisco.
And that leads us to the why Kyle Shanahan wasn't hired. And it wasn't the fact that they were surprised by how good he did in his interview. That's always been a ridiculous notion.
Why would you be surprised that he had a good interview?
Yeah.
Considering he was around Mike. Forget about being Mike Shanahan's son.
Right.
He worked under Mike in Washington, worked hand in hand constructing that offense. We know about Mike Shanahan's attention to detail, famously. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason why Kyle Shanahan would not have attacked the interview without that degree of preparation. I mean, it's something I think that you should have expected.
You should have expected, but there were certain parties, that didn't want Mike Shanahan back in the building.
Well, I can say this. I worked for the Broncos organization during some of Mike Shanahan's latter years. I don't want to get too much into it. There are certain things I'll take to the grave with me. But the thing that happened with Mike Shanahan in the building in those years is he basically became bigger than the organization. That's not a healthy thing. The coach can be big and significant, but not to the point where they're getting their tentacles into areas that they shouldn't necessarily be.
Right.
And it wasn't even a decade since Mike Shanahan had been dismissed by Pat Bowlen. We're talking about early 2017 here. So you were barely 8 years past when Mike Shanahan got fired. And I don't think enough time had passed, and certainly not enough struggle, because the previous year they'd gone 9-7. It's not like you were looking at a team that was in a bad spot.
Barely missing the postseason.
Yes. Was it a team that was in decline, getting older in certain spots? Yes,
sure.
Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And things that happened in 2017 kind of accelerate that, which is part of the reason why I think Kyle Shanahan's first year might have been a frustrating year. The lack of talent at the quarterback position, I think he only would have been able to get but so much out of it. Plus, overall, the team declining. Maybe they do a bit better. Maybe they're 6-10 instead of 5-11. But I don't think you're talking about a vintage Bronco year.
Well, let's break that down because of Kyle and because of Mike and because of what they did with Robert Griffin III. Now, RG3 and much more talented than Paxton Lynch.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say this: would Mike Shanahan and Kyle Shanahan been able to run those 8 plays that Billy Musgrave would always make fun of? Like, oh, you only ran 8 plays in college. Like, okay, we'll run those 8 plays instead of making him do something he wouldn't want to do. How would that have looked differently? Because they crafted the offense for RG3. Then RG3 kind of got a little big for his britches and wanted to scrap what they had already set up for him instead of running what they wanted him to run. Paxton Lynch couldn't run the Shanahan offense. It's too complicated. The language is too complicated. But would they have, toned things down? I don't want to say dumbed things down, but would they have toned things down enough where they could get some sort of football? Because the Broncos got 0 return on the Paxton Lynch pick. Would that have been different with Kyle Shanahan in 2017?
It's really interesting to think about that, because on the one hand, if they'd done that and Paxton Lynch had shown something, it might have changed the trajectory for Paxton Lynch.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, the notion that Kirk Cousins was going to be available was floating out there. Because remember, as San Francisco went through the 2017 season, until they traded for Jimmy Garoppolo, everything was pointing to Kirk Cousins. Now, I do not believe that Bill Belichick would have traded Jimmy Garoppolo to Kyle Shanahan if he had been coaching in the AFC. And that's where things kind of deviate. Because you could say, oh, well, what if the Broncos had made the trade for Garoppolo and put him in? Could it have been Jimmy G? While Bill Belichick had plenty of respect for Mike Shanahan and Kyle Shanahan and the type of coaching that Jimmy G was going to get, I don't think Belichick would have traded Garoppolo within the conference. So I think it would have still come down to Kirk Cousins. And the question is, does Paxton Lynch show enough to where, as the 49ers did with Garoppolo, they basically junked their plan? Like, once Garoppolo got in there and was succeeding, they were doing too well down the stretch that year. Like, okay, let's take the bird in the hand here and just re-sign Jimmy G. And by and large, it didn't work out badly. I mean, did they not get to 3 conference championships, 2 of them with Jimmy G over the following 5 seasons after that? No, right. I mean, we can debate the viability of Jimmy G as a quarterback and, from here until the cows come home, but he did pretty well for them. The question then becomes, okay, would the Broncos' success have looked very similar to the 49ers' success with a Kirk Cousins? Because one thing we've seen with Kirk, kind of similar to Garoppolo, is there seems to be a ceiling on what the team can accomplish with said quarterback. Very effective. And I would say Kirk Cousins is a better quarterback and a more effective quarterback than Garoppolo. Certainly, statistically speaking, absolutely. But would that have resulted in the same kinds of playoff finishes where you're getting there but just falling short? And the other thing that's different is the Niners operating in the NFC, with Kyle Shanahan and Jimmy Garoppolo and then Brock Purdy this past year. The AFC is a different beast entirely because you would have been competing with Patrick Mahomes in your own division, beyond your own division, Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, etc.
So much to get to on this what if edition of Orange and Blue today, presented by Champ Honda. And like, what if Kyle Shanahan was the head coach? I will say this, kind of my final thoughts, not necessarily Mace, because again, we could go on and on with this one.
I think we can agree they would be more successful.
Yes.
Than they have.
Kyle Shanahan would still be the head coach.
Sean Payton would not be the head coach. Russell Wilson, I don't think, would have ever been the Broncos quarterback.
Nope.
But would they have pushed it all the way and won a Super Bowl? My guess is they wouldn't. And I would say, since we know that Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers lost to the Chiefs in a Super Bowl, I would argue that the Broncos with Kyle Shanahan would have leveled off as a solid playoff contender, wild card type of team, again, because of the primacy of the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes. And we'd be sitting here with a different kind of frustration than we have today.
Well, you
the frustration
mentioned
of pushing and being in the conversation, but still not getting to that top level.
You mentioned the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes. I don't know if Mike's ever publicly gone on the record of his pre-draft thoughts on Patrick Mahomes, but let's just say another what if. What if he would have done for his son or advised his son and John Elway, and John would listen to Mike. You know, their relationships had some ups and downs, but, you know, they're solid.
Now I see where you're going. This is getting interesting.
What if he would, here's another 30 minutes. What if he, it almost should be another show. What if he would have doubled up on quarterbacks like he did with Washington, because Dan Snyder really wanted RG3 and he wanted Kirk Cousins.
So you're talking
about John Elway liked Paxton Lynch. Now it would be a year apart, not the same draft.
Oh, okay.
But what if he would have gone, okay, I know your guy Paxton. Yes, John. But let's bring in Pat Mahomes and see what he can do.
You would have to make that trade up.
Just like Kansas City. Kansas City moved up 16 spots.
The other thing that you consider is this. If you had that season, that bad season in 2017, maybe you're thinking about Kirk Cousins. But what if you're thinking, oh, these quarterbacks, this rookie class is looking pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Josh Allen can do even better than I think Kirk Cousins might.
It's unlimited butterfly effect.
Yeah. But I think the one thing we know is that this team would be a lot better at quarterback than it has been.
And the other thing, and my final point before I got off track.
The entire roster too.
Yes.
Because you're drafting for a different set of schemes and a different set of needs with a different set of parameters. I mean, how many players that are on the current Broncos, if Kyle Shanahan had become the coach, would still be there, would be there today? Justin Simmons might literally be it. Otherwise, the whole landscape completely unrecognizable.
And I'll say this, like, there's a lot of players on this roster from previous years that wouldn't have, they've been barely holding on. Mm-hmm. The one thing that I would love most about Kyle Shanahan, to me, Mace, the Broncos way is running the ball. Mm-hmm. And I know 2013 was great and Peyton Manning and 50 touchdowns and all that was fantastic. But the Broncos way has always been running the ball. So come hell or high water, better quarterback situation, but their identity, they've been without an identity for years, almost a decade. You would have the Shanahan continuation from Gary Kubiak. You would still be emphasizing the basic fundamentals of Broncos football, which to me is run the ball, play great defense.
Yeah, you would. Damn.
And with that, we wrap up this special edition during the slow time of Orange and Blue Today, presented by Champ Honda. He's Andrew Mason. You follow him on Twitter at Mace Denver. I'm at Cecil Lammey saying, stay frosty, everybody.